Good morning, everyone, or sorry, afternoon now officially.
Good afternoon.
Just give a minute while everything else logs in. Hope everybody is getting prepared for our celebration of Purim tomorrow night. Remember that we will have both live streaming Zoom connection, check the website for the Zoom link, as well as in-person but socially distant and other COVID precautions observed services tomorrow at 6 p.m. And for those of you that are normally part of the Pathway to Judaism course, you should probably notice the conflict there. That's right, we're going to be doing Purim, so there is no separate Pathway to Judaism course tomorrow. You absolutely can't go a week without it. You can always check the YouTube backlog. Or I guess back catalog would be the right term. All right, so let's go ahead and get down to work for our discussion. So last week in Parashat Truma, we talked a little bit about the tachash, the dolphin skin that was used as a covering, and what it served, not just in a physical way, but also as a symbolic way of the focal point of the Mishkan, of drawing people together and using it as a tool more than just as a decoration. This week we are going to continue in Tetzaveh, of course, with the discussion of some of the clothing that was made and worn by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. There are a lot of different elements to what he wore, and we've talked about some of them before. We've talked about the Choshen Mishpat, the breastpiece of decision. We've talked about the Urim and Tumim, as we'll mention in our beginning text here, the stones of decision, you could call them. But we're going to talk about something else that has not been in our topic yet. And of course, we have talked in general terms of how the modern decorations of the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, very much echo the different clothing that were on the Kohen Gadol, and of course the symbolism of the written Torah as becoming a replacement for the high priest. But I want to delve into another aspect, one that we haven't touched on before, and see if we can't glean some additional information, insights from it. So with that in mind, we're going to pick up mid-chapter in chapter 28, and we're going to pick up on verse 29. And the discussion of the clothing for Aaron, who would be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is already underway, and continuing the discussion of the mishpat, the Choshen Mishpat, the breastpiece, remember it was cloth, that he wore. And we'll use that as our linkage to our focus. Aaron shall carry the names of the sons of Israel on the breastpiece of decision over his heart when he enters the sanctuary for remembrance before the Lord at all times. So we've talked about this in the past, that on the Choshen Mishpat, on this breastpiece, there would be 12 different gems, which would be each inscribed with one of the names of one of the tribes. So this would be his way of carrying all of the nation with him when he performed his duties. Okay, verse 30. Inside the breastpiece of decision, as it was a long cloth piece that was folded, there would be a natural little pocket formed by the folding of the cloth. Inside the breastpiece of decision, you shall place the Urim and Tumim, so that they are over Aaron's heart when he comes before the Lord. Thus Aaron shall carry the instrument of decision for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord at all times. see the past classes about the Urim and Tumim to go into more detail on them. You shall make the robe of the ephod a pure blue. So this overall tunic would be made with techelet, that beautiful blue that was also used as the thread on the tzitzit, on the fringes of a talit. If anyone is interested about the modern usage of techelet, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to give you some insights on that. 32, continuing with this clothing, the opening for the head shall be in the middle of it. The opening shall have a binding of woven work round about. It shall be like the opening of a coat of mail, so that it does not tear. So the tunic that he is wearing over the top of his head will just be embroidered around the neck so that it doesn't fray and fall apart. That it would have been slightly unusual, that additional level of workmanship. 33. On its hem, make pomegranates, rimonim, of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, all around the hem, with bells of gold between them all around. So there would be a little bauble, a little pom-pom, if you will, of this yarn in the shape of a pomegranate, which is very ball-shaped. And then they would alternate with bells in between. And indeed, we still call the finials that go on top of the Torah handles, we call those rimonim, and they contain bells in commemoration, in remembrance of this part of the attire of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. A golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate, all around the hem of the robe. So this was a encircling of the clothes, of the robe that he wore, so that as he moved, you would hear a beautiful sort of tinkling noise. Any questions or comments so far? Okay. 35. Aaron shall wear it while officiating, so that the sound of it is heard when he comes into the sanctuary before the Lord and when he goes out, that he may not die. Indeed, there was a tradition that if the sound stopped, that meant that he had died, and they would pull him out of the Holy of Holies, since no one else was allowed to go in. So this was also a little bit of a security feature to make sure that if anything went wrong, they would be alerted and be able to withdraw him from that place. You shall make a frontlet. All right, so the word frontlet here I'm going to have to replace, because we're going to be using this a lot. And I'll duck back in occasionally from frontlet and plate. But the Hebrew word that is used is seats, which is a great word, which is not often seen in general conversation because it's a fairly rare item. But seats is the name for this item. It's called a frontlet because, as you'll see, it is worn on the front of the head. You shall make a frontlet of pure gold and engrave on it the seal inscription, Holy to the Lord, Kodesh Ladonai, suspended on a cord of blue so that it may remain on the headdress. The headdress was called the mitznefet, or mitznafet you'll see here because of the causal form of the vocalization. The mitznefet was the almost turban-like headdress that the Kohen Gadol wore. And this seats, this frontlet, was a gold plate that went across the forehead area, and it remained at the front of the mitznefet, of the headdress, or just below it, or on it. There's actually a lot of debate of exactly how this was organized, but across it was the phrase Kodesh Ladonai, holy to the Lord. Does everyone have that visualization? I don't want to make it too specific. I'm avoiding graphics, like I said, because there is a debate about exactly how this was located and even exactly how the inscription was carried out. But I just want to make sure that you have a generic idea that we're looking at a large headdress and a gold plate somewhere on the forehead area with this phrase, holy to Adonai, holy to the Lord. Just a second. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, that Aaron may take away sin arising from the holy things that the Israelites consecrate for any of their sacred donations, It shall be on his forehead at all times to win acceptance for them before the Lord. Okay, first half, it's on his forehead. Makes perfect sense. And it's taking away sin. That Aaron takes away the sin, lifts off the sin that comes from the holy things that the children of Israel bring as consecrated offerings. And this will somehow make it more favorable to God. It's a magic headband? What's going on here? Why is this? What job does this have? This doesn't fit into the general pattern of everything else that we've seen. We've seen the symbology of the Choshen Mishpat, of the breastpiece. We've in other times talked about the symbology of the different clothing that he wore, even the mitznefet, the headdress. We know, of course, about the symbology of the Mishkan as a whole, and of the menorah and the incense and the altar and all. But this little gold tiara of the Kohen Gadol seems to be doing a rather important job in a way that doesn't seem to fit the rest of the symbology. So, as you can guess by me focusing on this and sharing the naive confusion over it, this is what we're going to be looking at in more detail. So, before we get into the detail of our commentaries to help us try and navigate what this could mean and how we should relate to it in the modern world, any questions on the other passages that we read of the clothing and preparations? Remember, we just touched a little bit on the Choshen Mishpat, the breastpiece, and the Urim and Tumim, the stones of decision, and just a brief mention of the Rimonim as well as the mitznefet.
I have a question about verse 38 and the use of the word holy and holiness, which I see it in my Fox translation, but not in the others. It says, Aaron is to bear the iniquity of holy offerings that the children of Israel offer as holy all their gifts of holiness. So do we have the root word for kadosh happening multiple times here?
Oh, yes. So we get it as the noun, right? Kodoshim. Those are in the translation we're looking at here is the phrase holy things. And then Ishu is the word that's being translated as consecrate. Right. Because it's the verb form of to make holy, which in English we have a fancy word consecrate rather than just relying on the word, holy. We don't say you holyize it. We don't talk about the holification. We talk about the consecration. And so that's just a quirk of English that we use a very different root word when talking about the verb form of making something holy. But Hebrew doesn't bother with that. Hebrew uses holy for the item and holy eyes to make holy, to make sacred the items. That's the verb that's being done by the children of Israel. And then the phrase that's being used here for sacred donations is the word that's the kodshehem that comes at the end of that phrasing, right? They're holy things.
Right.
So we in one sentence we get holy, consecrate, and sacred in English, but in the Hebrew it's holy, holy, holy as a root word. So yeah, that's one of the challenges that I know that Fox faced when he was trying to do his translation, was that he wanted to try and capture the, I don't know if the word's repetitive, he wanted to try and capture the consistency, that's the right way, the consistency of translation of Hebrew words in order that people could recognize that the same Hebrew word or root was being used in multiple locations, especially in sentences like this, where there is an aggregate. The cumulative effect is very important. But that's hard to pull off and make it sound readable or elegant English, which is why this translation went for elegance rather than repetition. Other questions? All right, so let's go take a look at this seats. I'm just going to roll us back up here so we get to verse 36 where we find out a little bit about it and make sure that's on our page as well because we might be popping back. All right, let me just adjust the layout of various technology bits. So the seats, right? This was a kind of golden plate, 2 fingers in breadth, meaning this wide, going around the forehead from ear to ear. So we've got a headband that goes around like that, 2 fingers wide. That was the basic geometry that we were talking about, says Rashi, based on the analysis of the rabbis in the Talmud, based off the oral tradition, since obviously the Torah doesn't come with pictures. And then Rashba, his grandson, in fact, gives us a succinct description. There was a single strand of blue wool, the techelet wool, at either end of the tzitz, which extended from ear to ear so that the headband could be tied by means of it. So you have the metal plate going around, and it was attached to a wool cord that could then be tied to attach it. There were also 3 strings above the tzitz, which crossed the high priest's heads, linking up with the woolen strand and attached to the mitznefet worn by the high priest. Now he is bringing his grandfather's analysis, Rashi's analysis, which was much lengthier and didn't fit with our discussion today. But there is a lot of debate and discussion of how exactly this fit on, in front of, beneath, around the mitznefet headdress, the turban. I didn't want to go into that in too much detail, but I just want you to understand that if you look at pictures and some of them have it sitting on the skin, some of them have it sitting on the turban itself, there's reason to believe that either of those might be true. And it could be that there was just one cord going around. It could be there was the one cord plus additional support straps that would bind it also to the mitznefet, to the turban. I don't want to get caught up in that particular fashion detail, but I did want to make sure that you understood it was involved with the headdress, with the mitznefet, but there is some debate about it. Indeed, Rashbam goes on to say that the headband was to be worn immediately below the lower rim of the mitznefet. So you'd have the headdress, and right underneath it, you would have the headband. There's more to say about the location and all of that, but it's a technical matter that I'm not sure is going to be helpful for us in our conversation today. Okay, but Rashbam very helpfully goes on to try and tell us why it is that this seats is worn where it is. And again, like I love to point out in numerous other times, when a commentary is giving us an answer to a question that you didn't ask, that is a reminder that you're not asking enough questions. All right, let's make sure you got that. If they're answering a question that you never thought about, like, why is it on the head? Then that means you should have asked, why is it on the head? Remember, the description of the Torah about this, seats about this, yes, talks about it being on the head, but when it talks about its purpose, it talks about somehow lifting sin in some way or another. There is no obvious reason why we should immediately think that an item which is doing the job that the seats is doing would be located on the forehead. That is a choice. It's not like if you said, it keeps your feet from getting hurt, so of course it has to be on your feet. This could be located anywhere. It could have been an armband. It could have been something wrapped around his forearm. It could have been on his thigh. I mean, we could have located an item to do the job, theoretically, anywhere. But the Torah locates it on the head. Since it's located on the head, a commentary is needed to at least hypothesize why the head was the location. The name seats reflects the fact that this head plate is worn on a place that everybody looks at on the forehead of the high priest. So Rashbam is telling us that this seats had to be prominent, and that prominence is part of its job. Indeed, we're going to look at that in more detail, but he's also giving us our first clue of this etymology of the word seats. Seats is not a common word in the Tanakh, in the Bible. It seems to be connected to both something that is shining, which makes a lot of sense, as well as something that is blossoming. It is something that is, you might say, splendid, to try and get a similar English word. But no word is ever going to perfectly match a word from a different language. This is the word that's used for the blossoming of a flower. It is also used for something that is shining and radiant and attractive. So we can see how those might be connected, even if they're not perfectly connected in English. So Rashbam is telling us that this seats, this splendidness, was meant to be figured somewhere where it could draw the attention, and what is more prominent than the forehead. This is one of the most observed items of any person's appearance. Even though we might think that the jeweled breastpiece is going to get more attention, the fact is that humans are trained to look at human faces. We look at them, we analyze them much more than any other part of a human. No matter how attractive some other thing might be that draws my attention, whether because of beauty or because of something that's odd, the face is where human biology tells us to focus. And Rashbam, as a good student of human nature, knows that and says, it's splendid, it's radiant, it's this blossoming. Of course it has to be on the head. And of course that means that God wanted everybody to see it. That this job that it is doing is not a hidden job. The job that it's doing is something that should be noticed and focused on by the people who are seeing the Kohen Gadol doing his job. So we've got its prominence, we've got a place for it, and the place has to be prominent. Nothing's more prominent than the face, than the head. Okay, now we have to figure out what it was actually doing there and a little bit more about how it functioned. So Or HaChaim reminds us that across it is engraved the words, holy to God, holy to Adonai, and he wants to analyze that for us. This means as long as the words, holy unto God, appeared on the golden plate, this was acceptable. When the Talmud said in Shabbat 63 that the words were arranged in 2 rows, meaning that the name was engraved on top and the word holy followed by the letter Lamed underneath, such an arrangement of the words was not mandatory. You will find there that Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Yossi, reported that while in Rome, he personally had seen the seats which the Romans had captured, and that the words, holy unto God, were engraved on it in a single line. This proves that the order in which the words were engraved did not matter. When Maimonides wrote in his treatise on the items of the temple that the words appeared in 2 rows, with the word holy in the second line, this does not present a difficulty. He referred only to the preferred way of engraving these words. So there was a long discussion in the Talmud about how exactly the words were arranged. And what Or HaChaim is giving to us as a condensed version of the analysis is that the location of the words were less important than their presence. That the phrase holy to God appeared in whichever configuration worked on the gold piece was what was important. The precise layout from a graphical design point of view is less important. The preferred way seems to have been on 2 lines, but if it was written across 1 line, that was still perfectly valid. So that is further refining our understanding that the gold plate had to be prominent, it had to be visible, and what was important were the words, but not the particular graphic design of the words. Everyone still with me? Okay. Skip the next section from Rabbeinu Bachya, as he gives us another set of summaries. According to the view of Ravad, another commentary we haven't looked at, but it's nice to bring him through the means of Bachya, the inscription on the lower line was holy, like we saw, holy to, more specifically, so that only the name of the Lord was inscribed on the upper line. The letter Lamed was at the end of the upper line, whereas the name of the Lord appeared at the beginning of the lower line, near the end of the right, at the right. The reason Maimonides called the upper line lower and the lower line upper is because he considered what is at the end of the line as lower and what is at the beginning of the line as upper. Okay, you should all be nice and thoroughly confused, but what he is trying to clarify through the commentary of the Ravad was that, in fact, the name of God would have been at the lower side, so that the words would actually be in what we would consider the correct order. It would be very easy to think from the reading of the Talmud that the name of God was engraved literally above the other words, which grammatically would be very awkward. And what he's trying to say is that, in his opinion, it was instead written in the same order that you would expect, Holy to, and then Adonai, and simply by a miscommunication of how the words upper and lower is being used to find the different elements of the sentence, that you might have a mistaken view. Now, again, this is highlighting the fact that the layout of the inscription, while we are willing to talk about it, seems to have been less important than the actual content of the inscription. Instead, that it existed, that those words were on it, and that it was figured prominently, seems to have been the main focus, which he goes on to discuss. The headplate, the seats, was one of the 8 vestments of the high priest. However, strictly speaking, it was not a garment, but a decoration, a kind of jewelry. If our sages always speak about 8 vestments which the high priest would adorn himself in, they simply included this adornment with the other 7, which are garments in the true sense of the words. So first he wants to lay the ground that yes, our tradition often will talk about the 8 garments of the high priest, but not to be pedantic, technically this isn't a garment, this is an adornment, this isn't a piece of clothing to be worn, this is a piece of jewelry to be added, but understand that when they are counting to 8, this is number 8 of that list. In fact, the other 7 garments symbolized the 7 heavens, the different metaphysical understanding of the separation between earth and heaven, meaning that there are multiple layers of greater and greater perfection between us and God. This was part of both a cosmology as well as a philosophy, meaning, yes, some people in the ancient world literally believed there were elevations in which the 7 visible planets moved, but this was also meant spiritually, with the idea that our world is multiple times removed from the ultimate perfection of God. And the ultimate perfection of God, the golden headplate represented the highest of all the heavens, the 8th heaven. So the words inscribed on the headplate are an allusion to the principle that the glory of the princess is best seen by the fact that she stays out of the limelight. As Psalms 45:14 phrased it, the royal princess, her dress embroidered with golden mountings, is led inside to the king. The chamber, meaning the uppermost heaven, referred to is the 10th, innermost. This is why the seats was made of pure gold and why it was appropriately inscribed with the words, Holy to God. This is also the meaning of the words engraved like the signet ring, Holy unto the Lord. All right, so it's a little confusing that he's trying to discuss here, but trying to put that on one screen. But what he is trying to phrase for us here is that this seats, this line, which is inscribed with the phrase Holy to God, represents this uppermost heaven, and within it, it represents the key to entering the innermost chamber of access to God's presence. And that this is reminding us of the hiddenness of God, of the hiddenness of the true connection to God that we can have, and that it will take a special key, if you will, to open that up, that it is sealed with God's name, it is sealed with the statement of holiness, precisely as a meditation, as a means of us to focus towards that ultimate innermost connection to God. I know that's a little metaphysical, perhaps even mystical. You can see my sermon from a few weeks ago about the difference between religious, spiritual, and mystical. But do you have any questions on that? I know this is a lot of heavy lifting for a small headband, but the concept that you're beginning hopefully to see through the commentary of how this headband was designed to focus our attention by its prominence and by its content in a way that, when taken with the totality of what the high priest was wearing, would lead us to a deeper understanding of God and thus a deeper connection with God, is the main point I want you to have by this point, or by this stage in our discussion. All right, so let's go ahead then and take a look at what he does with this concept. Let's see if I can get that. Oh, just can't put it on one screen. Okay, so we're just going to have to scroll when we get there. The Torah writes in verse 38 that the tzitz is to be worn on Aaron's forehead, and that it is to be on his forehead always. Right, that's, we just go back and take a quick look. You can see very clearly that it says that this is what he is always wearing, that is wearing it tamid, all times. How are we to understand the latter word, always? The word refers to the periods during which the high priest fulfills his specific functions in the temple or within the holy precincts. As you are already aware, the high priest served as a symbol, and so did his clothes while he wore them during the performance of his duties. So, when he was taking a nap, when he was just having lunch, he would not be wearing any of the priestly clothing, and he would not be wearing the tzitz either. Making sure that we understand that the tzitz is part of the overall costume of the high priest. It is not describing him per se, it is describing the totality of what he, through his proper appointment and adornment, represents. Because, as you are already aware, gives us a lot of credit, as you are already aware, the high priest served as a symbol, and so did his clothes while he wore them during the performance of his duties. This is the reason why the Torah wrote the word lezichron as a remembrance, as a symbol, in connection with the gemstones on the ephod and with the gemstones on the breastplate. You may remember, as we just back up here to where we began. Should be right there. Where did we? Sorry, just there we go. Right. Lezikaron lifnei Adonai tamid. That was worn as a remembrance before God. So the idea that the breastpiece was there as a remembrance is already giving us the clue that it was there for a symbolic function, that it was there to trigger something by its presence, but more importantly, by its consideration. The word remembrance is very close in meaning to the word dugma, as an example, or a model, or a symbol. The word tzitz itself is reminiscent of the Song of Songs, from Song of Songs 2:9. Metzitz min ha'arakim, right? He was peering through the lattices. So this phrase of tzitz, like I said, it doesn't come up a lot, but one of the places is in Shir HaShirim, where you see the male love interest peering out through the lattice work. And the phrase here is, of course, of that hiddenness. Aaron's inspiration came from the Shekhinah, which peered through the lattices, shuttered windows of the highest heaven, observing him performing his functions. So he is remembering as he wears this tzitz, almost as though God were watching through the lattices of the highest level of heaven. So it is making sure that he is mindful of what he is doing. It is making sure that he is aware of the responsibility that he carries, and making sure that we are aware of him being aware of God being aware, that there is remembrance all around in this process. And the word is related to Bayatzets seeds. It sprouted a bud, taken from number 1723, i.e. the topmost part of the fruit. So this is going back to the story in the book of Bamidbar, where Aaron is challenged for his leadership, and they set up a contest, if you will, to see whose rod will blossom. And this is the phrase talking about the budding of Aaron's rod. Wherever the word seats occurs, it alludes to the highest of something. Just as this particular ornament symbolized the highest emanation, the highest attribute of God, so all the vestments symbolized something of that nature. So this seats is representing this highest emanation of God as connected through the service and giving us that remembrance in its performance. We'll talk about how that applies to its ultimate function in just a second, but I want to check and see if you have any questions before we move on. I know today's discussion is a little technical, a little complicated, but I have great faith that we'll get through it.
I have a question. It has to do with this relating to the function of the high priest, as it says in Malachi that the priest is an agent or messenger of Adonai Tzavaot. So it's kind of like, this is my job. And it's a reminder to the congregation, but also whenever he puts it on, that he is now, embodying that very important role, that's the continual presence is to have a continual messenger.
Very much, exactly. And that the Kohen Gadol is more about being the Kohen Gadol than being Aaron. His identity while wearing these clothes is very much, I am the Kohen Gadol and I have this particular job. And the idea of as a messenger is a very good one, but it's a messenger in two directions, meaning that he is bringing before God the needs of the community, but he is also reflecting that God is concerned, God cares about the community at that same time. It's not that he was a prophet, although Aaron himself was, but it's not that every Kohen Gadol would be a prophet, a messenger in the terms of literally bringing a statement from God, but a representative that God indeed is looking, God indeed is peering at us, and God indeed cares about us. It was a very important symbol.
Well, the reason I was asking is, it goes back to my first question about the root word kadosh occurring consistently, because one of the themes of these parashiot is, this is how you keep the presence of Adonai with you.
Or just to refine that a little bit, this is how you keep yourself aware of the presence of Adonai with you. That God would be with us, no problem, but we can make God further from us in our perception of God's presence, or we can make God feel closer to us in our perception of God's presence. And this whole elaborate ceremony was designed to bring God as close as possible in our perception. Obviously, we can't move God because God doesn't have a location to be shoved around in, but we can move our own feeling of connection. And indeed, we do it, unfortunately, all the time, too often in the wrong direction. All right, so excellent segue as we move into our final discussion from Rashbam of how this actually then is meant to work in its originally stated, sorry, I can't talk and read text at the same time, at its originally stated goals from verse 38, that Aaron may take away sin arising from the holy things that the Israelites consecrate from any of their sacred donations. The names of the tribes of Israel are engraved on both the gemstones of the ephod as well as on the breastplate. So he has them on the shoulders, as described elsewhere. He has them on the breastpiece. These names were to remind God of the merits of the founding fathers of these tribes and to facilitate atonement for the sins of their descendants. The specific sin referred to are inadvertent violations involving sacred sites entered in violation of the law, or the consuming of sacred sacrificial meat, by people either not entitled to eat them or not in a ritually pure state, which would be the prerequisite for eating the same. While the high priest wore the tzitzit, God undertook to forgive such inadvertent violations committed by the people concerned. So what he is trying to say here, and this is again based on the analysis of the rabbis that came before him, specifically a long discussion in the Talmud, is that the tzitzit was a connection to God, for us to God, but also of us to know that God remembered our ancestors, as were symbolized on the shoulder and chest of the high priest, and that if we made mistakes, especially the accidental type of mistakes that we had no way of knowing that we were making, not the accidents that we could have prevented, but the accidents that are simply beyond our understanding, that God was going to let it slide, that God was going to forgive them. God was going to not hold us accountable for the mistakes over which we had no way of preventing when we were committing them, because we weren't even aware that a mistake was being committed or that a mistake might be being committed. And so there is a truth that is being shared here that is too often missed when we talk about our religion and also when we talk about each other. And that is that, yes, there are mistakes that people make that absolutely could have been avoided. Very simple, very straightforward. If you weren't texting, you probably wouldn't have hit the car in front of you. That's not an accident. That was, you made a mistake. On the other hand, there are other mistakes that we may not be aware of. We may be completely unaware of and cannot become aware of, at least not until it might be too late. And the question would become, how do we relate to that, both personally and spiritually? Do I obsess? Do I wring my hands, constantly worried that at some point I may have accidentally committed a mistake that has, in this case, ruined a sacrifice that I meant to give, which in and of itself is a problem, but now it means I shouldn't have eaten, and I've committed a transgression by eating something when I wasn't ritually pure, or by eating something that wasn't ritually pure that should have been. How do I avoid the obsession over this and the anxiety and the self-loathing that can sometimes come? And what the Talmud is saying, and Rashbam is trying to give us as a summary here, is that tzitz is there to remind you, God forgives that, right? God understands that. God is not asking you to be perfect. God is not asking you to be superhuman in your understanding of the potential errors and to avoid things that you are completely unaware of. Because if you are unaware of it completely and should not be expected to be aware of it, God's okay with you doing your best. And that is something that liberates you from having to be constantly in petrified fear that somehow, without your knowing, and despite your best efforts, you have somehow ended up in a terrible, terrible place. One of the things that I find most beautiful in Judaism is this model of God, which demands so much from us, but only demands what we are capable of. God never demands that we aspire to some infinite level of punctiliousness where we can supersede and transcend our human limitations to be able to be perfect like God. Instead, God merely asks us to do our human best. And having done that, God is willing to ignore all of the other mistakes that might have happened that were completely and unavoidably and inadvertently tied into what we just did. And so too, this is something that we need to connect when we are dealing with each other. Yes, a lot of people refuse to take responsibility, refuse to live up to the mistakes that they make, or refuse to even take minor efforts to avoid such mistakes. But there is also a tendency when we have been wronged to assume that the person that wronged us did so deliberately, or at least did so out of negligence. Sometimes we have to take a step back and admit that as much as we feel wronged by what happened, as much as we may have been hurt or damaged by what happened, sometimes it just happened. And the other person really should not be held in such low esteem. We should not be so angry with them personally, as we should simply be frustrated in the situation. And allowing ourselves to ignore those kinds of mistakes, those minor slips that someone else made without even knowing they did it. The person who accidentally jostled you while rushing through the hallway without even realizing you were there. When we give them enough room to recognize that something happened, that they didn't mean to, and that they probably couldn't have even avoided if they'd been trying, oftentimes we will find that we will get an apology from them, that they want to make amends, that there can be a reconciliation, rather than holding others accountable to an impossible standard. And that level of forgiveness is something that we can try and share. And after all, it seems only fair, since God is offering to share that level with us. And in fact, God has inscribed as his seal upon this very concept of forgiveness of that which is unavoidable, the phrase holy to God, that we are all holy to God, and we do our best. We live up to the call that God has given to us of being the most moral and ethical and careful people we can be, but we forgive each other our mistakes because we know God forgives ours. Questions or comments on this concept?
I'm reminded of Psalm 19, the verse, "But who can detect their errors? Clear me of hidden faults," which we read every Shabbat. I always pause for a moment when I get to that verse, because there's so much that we do that we overlook, that we may not be aware of, but clearly God knows it.
And not only knows it, but forgives it. And there's another statement of, if God kept track of every sin, who could stand before God? We don't even know the score, so to speak, of what we've done right and what we've done wrong. We're not playing a video game where there's a little score above our head to tell us all of the commandments we've done right and all the commandments we've done wrong. We have to do the best we can. And I mean that, do the best we can. We don't just sit back and say, God will forgive me. You honestly have to do your best and constantly check to see if you have done something that you didn't notice at first, if there is a way to fix it, if there is something that you can improve. Absolutely, we need to be doing that on a daily basis of reflection. But we also need to let go of the more dangerous aspects of that type of obsessive thinking that leads us into thinking that we need to be more than human, because ultimately God made us as we are. Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up? And I will leave you to your Purim preparations. Again, we are doing Purim tomorrow night at 6 p.m. You're welcome to join us through our normal live stream, through the special Zoom link available on our website, or you can contact me directly if you can't find it, or if you're willing to follow the COVID precautions we have, to come to the in-person Megillah reading at the sanctuary. Again, that's going to be tomorrow at 6 o'clock. At 7:45 a.m. on Friday morning, there will be a community Megillah reading as well. That is only going to be streamed, and you can find the link for that at the Ohev Shalom website.
I wanted to let you know I saw Dr. Zaga yesterday for the Hadafat.
Oh, great. Why don't you send me an email with the fill-ins? I don't think all of YouTube needs to know all the details.
All right, yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
And a reminder to all the people who normally come for the Pathway to Judaism class, obviously tomorrow that's preempted. That'll be substituted with the Purim celebration. So no Pathways tomorrow, but lots of Purim. Take care, everyone. Have a joyous Purim. Purim Sameach.
Sameach. Thank you.